To order videotapes using your Visa or MasterCard, or to receive a free Pacific Arts video catalog, call 1-800-538-5856.
On the afternoon of the 2nd of August 1964, the US destroyer Maddox was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. Radar operators saw 3 blips on their scopes, which were identified as North Vietnamese motor torpedo boats. In spite of warnings from the Maddox, the MTBs attacked, and the Maddox opened fire. The only carrier in the area was the USS Ticonderoga. 4 of her Vought F-8 Crusaders came to the rescue of the Maddox and sank one of the Vietnamese patrol boats with gun and Zuni rocket fire. The Maddox was then joined by the USS Turner Joy, and on the night of August 4th, more unidentified contacts were detected on radar. The North Vietnamese patrol boats had returned. The attack was renewed. On August the 10th, Congress passed its Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
The US Navy had already had a presence in Vietnam for some time, in the form of the US Military Assistance Command. US Navy advisors had been helping the Vietnamese Navy develop methods of countering North Vietnamese guerrillas. The US Navy had already had its first casualty. On June the 6th, 1964, one of the USS Kitty Hawk's F-8s had been shot down over Laos.
Stand by to start. F4,
But in spite of the Tonkin resolution, things were quiet on the US carriers patrolling the Gulf in the last months of 1964. For 6 months, it was a state of readiness only. No further strikes against North Vietnam were flown until February 1965.
Black smoke, 3 Alpha boiler. All right, clear stacks up, Roger.
What is the IFF on contact 330?
The US naval force in the Gulf was the 7th Fleet. As well as the carriers, it had a full complement of cruisers like the USS Canberra and the traditional destroyers, the backbone of the fleet. The largest of the 7th Fleet's destroyer class was also a naval pacesetter, the USS Bainbridge, the world's first nuclear-powered guided missile frigate. Carriers on combat alert were known as being on the line. On the line in the Gulf of Tonkin in early 1965 were the attack carriers, the USS Coral Sea, Hancock and Ranger. After 6 months of preparation, alertness but no strike activity, the situation was about to change. On February 7, 1965, the carrier air wings launched a 100-aircraft Alpha strike in retaliation against the North. 3 US aircraft were lost and an F-8 pilot was taken prisoner. Then in March, Dagger Thrust, an integrated naval and Marine Corps operation, went into action. 7th Fleet Marines landed at Da Nang, Chui Lai and then Vung Mu. On land, dagger thrust marked a basic change in American strategy. Retreating defense with retaliatory strikes against guerrillas gave way to all-out offense. In the air, the same thing was happening. Rolling Thunder, a sustained program of bombing against the north, had begun. On March 18, the first Navy flights in the Rolling Thunder operation were flown from the Coral Sea and the Hancock. Rolling Thunder was to become a lengthy process, and throughout its duration, 2 to 3 carriers were kept on the line in the Gulf of Tonkin. This operation centre for carriers striking against the north became known as Yankee Station. Logically then, the centre for carrier operations supporting the ground battle in the south became Dixie Station. The carrier fighters flew support on these missions, but they had to wait a while before seeing real action. They had their first brush with combat on April the 9th, 1965. Some F-4 Phantoms flying a bar cap, or Barrier Combat Air Patrol, strayed too close to China and ran into MiGs from the Air Force of the People's Liberation Army. In a dogfight near the island of Hainan, the F-4s claimed a probable, but at a price. One of the Phantoms failed to return. On June 17, 2 MiG-17s became the first confirmed kills of the war. But 3 days later, on June 20, there was a real surprise victory. Another MiG-17 was shot down, no surprise in itself, but this time the victor was an unlikely one, a piston-engined A-1 Skyraider. The North Vietnamese pilot had made the mistake of trying to engage it at low speed. After the start of Rolling Thunder, a succession of carriers was deployed to the Gulf of Tonkin. A system was developed for the preparation of the ships and their personnel. It began back in the US at NAS Fallon in Nevada, where the Air Wing squadrons underwent intensive training. Then, once they'd joined their carrier, training continued while the carriers made their way to the operational area off the Vietnamese coast. The usual next step was that the carriers were assigned to Dixie Station, where the aircrew could get experience in combat situations less demanding than those they would encounter later on in the north. After this on-the-line initiation, the carriers made their way to the Philippines for a period of rest and relaxation at Cuby Point. When they'd taken on supplies, they made their way to Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, where over the next few months they alternated 2 to 3 week periods on the line with R&R at ports like Hong Kong. Sometimes, if they'd replaced losses with inexperienced aircrew, the carrier would return to Dixie Station for additional training. During this time, all the routines of carrier operation continued. Boatswain's Mate Second Class Richard Hammond.
As boatswain mates, we handle the ship as they handled ships of old, with lines and all sorts of associated equipment. The two that work together the closest are your boatswain mates and your engineers. Your engineers keep the ship running, they keep us with fresh water, they keep us with fuel, and they supply the speed. We as bosun mates keep the ship maintenance-wise up to par, keep all of our topside areas up to date with gear, and keep everything running and working in working order. We handle everything such as refueling and high lines.
While they were on station, the carrier's continuing needs, like food and fuel, were attended to by a fleet of supply ships. Supply ship and carrier steamed side by side as a process called underway replenishment was carried out. While the serious business was going on, a brisk trade was conducted in movies, whatever movie was available at the time. And sometimes the trade was in humans, like this doctor making his first journey on the High Line. The human forces involved in keeping a carrier operating are many and varied. Vice Admiral Ralph W. Cousins.
We have a mixture here of old pros and a large part, perhaps 75% or more, are men and young officers who are on their first combat tour, their first enlistment in the Navy in the case of the men. Nevertheless, it's always gratifying to me and I think surprising to many people to see how the young men pitch in, take their share of responsibility. The young fellows who last year were on a high school football team or working at a gas station this year out here have a vital part in this team, whether they're down in the engine room or working in a shaft alley or tending a boiler or up working on the arresting gear on the flight deck. They're all in a responsible place, and for many guys it's the most responsibility they'll ever have.
The weather in the tropics is not always balmy, and in the typhoon season off the Vietnamese coast, the deck of a carrier is no picnic.
This event 7 Delta will be running the Route 14 route recce from Pleiku down to Ban Mateau. There should be automatic weapons along the route. There's some artillery fire down just north of Ban Mateau. Okay, everybody get your radios and get the data down off the board here and you'll be ready to man it.
Different types of missions were flown from the carriers on Yankee Station. Bar caps and force caps were fighter patrols in the vicinity of the carrier force to cover it against attack. MiG caps and tar caps were flown in support of offensive operations into North Vietnam. Res caps were flown in support of rescue operations, and each of these operations had their controller.
This is the bar cap, Barrier Combat Air Patrol, first line of defense for Task Force 77. We are providing control, much the same as around a civilian airport, with one important exception. MiG air bases are approximately 30 miles north of this aircraft, and at any time they may venture out. If they did, it would be my job to vector the bar cap into a position to meet the incoming raids. The pilots and the controllers all have nicknames. Some of them are very descriptive, such as the Hawk, Happy. I acquired the nickname of the Bear initially, and after a period of time it was shortened even further to the Teddy Bear. I'm known as the Teddy Bear of the Tonkin Gulf. These bar cap pilots are the world's greatest. It's often difficult sitting down here watching a couple of pips on a scope, especially after getting to know several of them personally after visits to the carrier, and then all of a sudden you have a pip disappear on you. It's a very shattering experience every time we lose one, particularly when you know someone personally.
The complement of aircraft aboard the carriers was usually made up in the following way. There were 2 VF or fighter squadrons. These were equipped with the McDonnell F-4 Phantom with Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles, or the older Vought F-8 Crusader, armed with 20mm cannon as well as the Sidewinders. There were 2 VA light attack squadrons. These were made up of Douglas A-4 Skyhawks, or the later Vought A-7 Corsairs. The 1 VA medium attack squadron was initially composed of Douglas A-1 Sky Raiders, which were later replaced by Grumman A-6 Intruders. VAH, or heavy attack, Douglas A-3 Sky Warriors initially flew bombing missions, but were later used as tankers, as were many other aircraft, including the A-4 Skyhawk. One of the roles of the North American A-5 Vigilante was in photographic reconnaissance. Airborne early warning was carried out by Grumman E-1B tracers, or E-2 Hawkeyes. Support in combat rescue and plane guard duty was provided by Sikorsky SH-3 and Kamenyu H-2 helicopters. To get all the fixed-wing aircraft into the air, there was one essential ingredient, the catapult.
No matter how many times you're catted off this carrier, you just never get used to the feel of a catapult shot. It's something that can never grow old, something you can never become accustomed to. It's somewhat akin to being hit in the chest by a Mack truck, yet still it's a very fine feeling because you know everything's working properly and you're going to get off the end of the aircraft carrier flying.
Once we get on the flight deck and start operating with the high noise level we have, we do most of our talking by hands and by lip movements. I personally worked and trained all of my crew on the Kitty Hawk to my own satisfaction. In almost 100,000 aircraft shots, we have never put an airplane in the water on account of a malfunction of the catapult itself.
To make the whole operation work, there's a well-trained army behind the scenes.
Ever since I've been on a ship, of course, the thing that's always impressed me so much is a hidden talent, or the guy that's off on the side that's doing a job that nobody ever really pays any attention to until he fails to do that job. The object is to catch a bunch of airplanes in as short a period of time as you can, and to launch a bunch of airplanes in as short a period of time as you have. They don't get the glory and the stuff of the other people out there on the flight deck where the action is, where it's nice to watch. Boy, there goes an airplane. Look at that. Boy, isn't that dangerous? It catches the eye. These people don't catch the eye, but their job, in my opinion, is just as important as the people in the action. Admittedly, every once in a while, you're going to have what we call a hairy one, or, boy, that's a wild one type pass. Knock that off. Don't do it again type thing. This occurs periodically, but it's nothing you accept. It's something you try to correct.
It's the role of the LSO, the landing signals officer, to make sure all those aircraft get safely back aboard the carrier at the end of their mission. US budget restrictions had the effect of causing shortages. One of those shortages was in the number of carriers available for the Pacific Fleet. Since construction of new carriers was a long process, other carriers were diverted from the Atlantic Fleet into the Vietnam theater. The most notable of these was the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise, which left Norfolk, Virginia in October 1965, eventually to be assigned permanently to the Pacific Fleet. Other carriers transferred included the Independence, America, Forrestal, F.D. Roosevelt, Saratoga, and Shangri-La. But for the Forrestal, this transfer was not altogether a happy one. In late 1986, the Oriskany had lost 44 sailors when a fire broke out in a flare locker. Then, in July 1967, aboard the Forrestal, a Zuni rocket was accidentally fired, hitting an A4's fuel tank. The fire spread and set off bombs and ammunition. The toll was very heavy. 134 officers and enlisted men were killed, 21 aircraft were destroyed, and 43 others were damaged. But for the Forrestal, it was the end of the war. The Oriskany had been more fortunate. She'd had 8 months out for repairs, but by the time of Forrestal's tragedy, was back in the war. The Enterprise was not to escape either. In January 1969, she was to have her own mishap involving Zuni rockets, when one overheated and caught fire. 28 men were killed and 343 injured. These carrier fires caused some of the heaviest casualties of the war. Rolling Thunder operations had resumed in late January 1966, working against communications in the Vietnamese panhandle. Losses to anti-aircraft fire were fairly heavy, and the MiGs continued to be a threat. This threat from the MiGs was to provide an impetus for the upgrading of fighter pilot combat skills, and for the pilots of the US Navy would take the Vietnam War into a new phase. In the years 1965 to 68, with a kill-to-loss ratio against the MiGs of 5 to 1, the fighter pilots of the United States Navy, on the face of it, seemed to have the ascendancy. But the overall kill-to-loss ratio of worse than 3 to 1 was not acceptable. The reason for this was that the US Navy fighters were frequently unable to protect their attack aircraft against the MiGs. And so, to upgrade the training of their fighter pilots, the Navy established its Top Gun Advanced Fighter Pilot course. Late 1967 and early 1968 saw the departure of one of the old faithfuls from the aircraft complements of the carriers. Gradually, the A-1 Sky Raiders were being replaced. They'd long looked incongruous among the newer and smarter inhabitants of the carriers' flight decks, such as one of their replacements, the A-6 Intruder all-weather attack aircraft. But their achievement in operations over both North and South Vietnam had been very significant. Meanwhile, Rolling Thunder operations against the North had been continuing, and their voracious appetite for missiles and bombs had to be fed with an enormous variety of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons. In early 1968, the Rolling Thunder operations were still the major focus of carrier activity. On the carriers, the maintenance crews went about their exacting task of making sure that the aircraft were ready, fit, and safe to fly their demanding missions. Everything had to be checked, down to the smallest detail, to make sure the only threat to the planes came from the enemy. But Rolling Thunder was about to come to an end. In April 1968, President Johnson once again limited operations to below the 19th parallel. As a result, for the remainder of 1968, Task Force 77's aircraft losses were much lower than for the previous year. The role of the carrier-based aircraft was changed to one of interdiction against enemy infiltration routes in Laos, Operation Commando Hunt. every mission, there was the pre-mission briefing.
All right, gents, don't forget to use your pink code word cards for the day.
Our dependency on other people starts right here in the ready room before a mission. We depend upon the photo reconnaissance people who go in over the beach unarmed, take pictures of our targets, bring them back out here. They're developed, put into the computers. We have the people flying the electronic reconnaissance missions. They also get the same type of information, and this is all correlated together in the computers. And our air intelligence people down at the other end of the ship correlate all this together, work out our missions for us, and we go down there and pick up this information that we need before we actually go out on a mission. We come down here to the ready room, and we have all this information right in front of us, all laid out here.
Okay, gents, you've had the rundown on the target, you've got the route, and how we're getting in there, a standard formation on the way down. Once we get ready to make the turn in to go coast in, we'll pick up a standard tactical formation, get it outspread nice and wide, and I'll call my throttle setting there, and we'll make our run in. Remember to keep the bird moving. Hadn't been a lot of fire, but we don't want to take any chances on it.
Okay, when we're ready for our mission, we start off by putting on right around 70 pounds worth of flight gear. The survival vest carries your radio, your flares, your dye marker, your survival kit, a small medical kit, water bottles. These are all the things that you really need to survive if you're going to be down in the jungle for any length of time. Of course, you strap on a .38 caliber pistol on your hip, and you're ready to go on up to the flight deck, get out there and do it.
We actually wear so much gear, at times you have the appearance of a big old teddy bear. You pretty well waddle up to the airplane, and at some point in the future, I think you can foresee a derrick to just pick up a pilot and sit him in the cockpit.
One of the side issues of the air war in Vietnam was the rivalry that built up between the pilots of the older F-8 and the later F-4. The F-8s operated from the smaller carriers, and in spite of their lesser number of days on the line, they outscored the F-4s in the early years of the war. The F-8s had guns, a fact of which their pilots were very proud, but in fact, most of their kills were made with Sidewinder missiles. The last F-8 kill was made on September 19, 1966, and from that point, the F-4 pilots began to overhaul the F-8s totally. The F-4's basic armament was the Sidewinder and radar-guided Sparrow missiles. Increased activity in the air war during 1972 gave them a real chance to make up ground, and by the end of the war, the scoreline read F-8's 18 victories and F-4's 38. The 200th mission was a landmark in the career of any Navy pilot. Combat cameramen in Vietnam documented many of them. Among them, this A-4 pilot, operating from the USS Enterprise. Having documented the departure of the pilot, the cameraman then had to wait anxiously for his subject's safe return. And a safe return brought immense relief and satisfaction to pilot and to cameraman. After the launching of the Vietnamese Spring Offensive in March 1972, carrier-based aircraft joined with the Air Force in Freedom Train missions into North Vietnam. Initially, operations were limited to below the 19th parallel, but by the end of April, they'd moved north of the 20th. While these Freedom Train operations continued, other aircraft were flying missions in support of B-52 raids into the Hai Phong area, under the name of Freedom Porch. For the carrier pilots, particularly those in fighters, the air war was hotting up again. Early 1972 was the peak period of operations for the carriers in Vietnam, and it was now time to see whether the Top Gun training had paid off. Lieutenant Randall H. Cunningham and Lieutenant William Driscoll had a very successful period in those months, with 5 victories. Lieutenant Cunningham comments on the North Vietnamese pilots.
A few of the pilots that we met were very easy to defeat. The last pilot that I fought was probably the roughest pilot I've ever fought against in my training or in combat. Every time I'd make an aggressive act or an offensive move toward him, he would counter that. He put me on the defensive twice, where we had to disengage. Having the power behind us in the Phantom, we were able to disengage, and we had to re-engage this individual.
In this press conference, Lieutenant Cunningham also commented on the relevance of traditional dogfighting tactics to the situation in Vietnam.
Very little changes since the time of Richthofen and Lufberry, Galan, Eric Hartmann of World War II, our Eddie Rickenbacker, and so on. The only thing that changes is relative motion, or closure rate. Our last fight was, in fact, it reminded me, I climbed up about 3,000 feet above the fight, and for a second almost everything went half action, you might say, and you'd watch one airplane going down burning on one side of you, MiGs climbing beside you and around you, and if you saw the movie Richthofen and Brown, for a second, for a brief instant, this is what it looked like, almost in a slow motion type. Your basic tactics since the Dicta of Bolka, which came out in 1918, it hasn't changed very much. You violate one of these dictas, and you won't be flying again.
Well, what are some of the things you can do wrong?
Well, you can fly straight and level for over 10 seconds, and you won't be around very long. You can lose your energy, or available energy, in altitude and airspeed. You can not check your own 6 o'clock when you're behind another MiG, and this is where Willie's area of responsibility is, and this is why he's so important. When I can concentrate on the MiG ahead of me, he can let me know what's going on behind me. You can, first sighting is a big important factor. You can misjudge your opponent's capabilities. You can misjudge his airplane, what he can do to you, his range of his guns, the range of his missiles. There's numerous things that can cost you the battle.
Cunningham and Driscoll flew an F-4J with Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles. What tactics did they have to employ for success with these weapons?
The F-4J does not have a gun in it. All of our MiG shoot-downs were with the Sidewinder missile. You have to position your airplane, however, in just about the same position as you do with guns, except that the range is a little farther back.
Here's an example of a missile strike on a MiG. But the presence of MiGs in the skies around them wasn't the only thing they had to be alert to. There was also the SAM, ground-to-air missile.
We have a variety of tactics. It is one of their tactics to get you out of altitude. They even launch a false missile system. They give you the L-band guidance, and which they don't even launch a missile, but we have indications that they have. And if you split S to a lower altitude, where their guns have a higher kill probability, and they do utilize this method, we do have various ways to defeat SAM missiles than we use.
Cunningham and Driscoll saw a lot of North Vietnamese pilots in action in early 1972. How aggressive were they?
In the past, they would hit and run. On this particular occasion that we were involved in, there were 20 of them and 6 of us. Now, they were aggressive to the point until a Phantom made an aggressive act toward them, and then they would disengage. Like, you'd have one chomping at you with his 20 millimeter. If you would try and break into him, he would break out to your 6 o'clock and disengage. On several occasions, they would go into the vertical with you, gain an advantage, and if you would make an aggressive act toward them, they would disengage again, where if they were more aggressive, they would have a Phantom in a precarious position.
Was there ever any conscious worry during aerial combat about being shot down?
If North Vietnamese is shot down, in 20 minutes he can return to his field and could probably come up again at you. Now, we can't do that. It is in our minds about possible POWs, but not at the time of the engagement itself. I can't ever remember thinking about becoming a POW when we were engaged. There's too much to think about. It's like when you're on the highway and the freeway, you're thinking about driving the car. You don't think about the accident unless you're about to get in one. The only time that I personally thought about becoming a POW is after we were hit and the airplane started to lose its hydraulic system. You're just too busy thinking.
Randy, do you have to make some adjustment in your thinking on tactics? It's one time when you're fighting a man and machine, and another time when you're fighting a computer and a SAM. What are the differences, or what do you have to worry about those?
Of course, we're very well knowledgeable, or we're versed in characteristics of SAM missiles, of MiGs, and you very seldom encounter both at the same time. Like when we went into the target area, they worked us over with SAMs first going in. In the target area, they worked us over with AAA. Then all of these stopped, and then the MiGs hit us. When we left the MiGs, the AAA and the SAM started again. So you don't usually have both.
For Lieutenant Cunningham, was combat something to look forward to?
It's hard to say. It's a chance to put what you've learned into use. And since you are over there to do a job, if you can eliminate the MiGs from your own strike force. See, these MiGs were trying to kill our flyers. They were in the air shooting at A7s and A6s. And it's our job to prevent them from shooting down our own airplanes. In that light, we were glad that we were able to help our own force. But I guess if you go up and don't see MiGs, I don't know if I look forward to it or not. I don't look forward to air-to-air combat, no.
But I understand that among the World War II fighter pilots, they say that one of the best lessons they got for actual combat was reading the books by World War I pilots. Has your study helped you?
Yes, it has. I found that in the actual combat itself, certain excerpts will flash through my mind that I've read. And I don't read just a book once, but I'll read through it until I can almost memorize the book. It's the same thing with missile parameters, the same thing with aircraft characteristics of the MiG, so that you can't actually think in a high-speed engagement like that. It has to be more by reaction. And 1,000 of these little thoughts, like, for example, I read in the Korean War where the MiG-15 used to disengage and put itself into a spin toward the ground to make the enemy pilot think, or the friendly pilot think, that he'd shot him down, when in essence he'd pull back up and come. Okay, I followed one of these MiGs down, and in essence that's what he had done. So all these little things go through your mind at the time, and I personally feel it's very important to study as much as you can. The odds here are not the odds, but the end results are a little more than a football game. You've got a little more to lose.
Commander Malcolm Guest talks about the qualities needed to fly these planes.
As a squadron executive officer, it's been my privilege and opportunity to observe these young pilots in action. We ask them to do more today than they ever were required to do at my lifetime at the stage of training the kids are going through. They continually, daily, are asked to do a terrific job, and they complete this job all on their own.
On the 19th of May 1972, President Richard Nixon announced Operation Pocket Money, the object of which was to mine the North Vietnamese ports. Between then and the end of the year, 11,000 mines were planted, blockading sea transport to the north. But the peak of carrier aircraft operation, which had seen Cunningham and Driscoll's success, was about to decline. In October, operations above the 20th parallel were suspended, and peace was thought to be imminent. Time for some time out. Time also for an old tradition concerning catapult officers whose tour had finished. The tradition was to do with their boots and with the catapults by which they'd launched many aircraft into combat. And there were other odd diversions, like curious Russian trawlers.
Soviets, they let ships up, position themselves in a talking gulf among our naval forces have a right to be here. This is international waters. Our guidelines are pretty much to be alert to him, but not to interfere, of course, with his operations. Same time, not to let him interfere with our operations. I want to keep the Soviet fellow getting onto the port just for his meanness. He's been trying to move around to see our starboard side, and really, I don't know what he'll gain, but we'll keep him interested anyhow by continuing to pass him to port.
The last 3 months of 1972 saw greatly reduced activity from the carriers, and it was widely believed that the war was coming to an end. But these beliefs were not vindicated, and the final act of the war was still to be played out. That final act was Linebacker 2, and it went into action on December the 18th. The object of Linebacker 2 was to force North Vietnam into a more conciliatory attitude in negotiations at the Paris peace talks. That objective was realized. The Vietnam ceasefire came into effect on January the 27th, 1973. But the role of the carriers had not been completely played out. There were still a few missions into Laos and logistical support to end sweep, the operation as part of the Paris Agreement to clear the mines from the North Vietnamese harbors. And their last contribution was not to occur until over 2 years later, when carriers provided support for the evacuations of Phnom Penh and Saigon. So what was the result of the contribution of carriers to the war in Vietnam? 17 carriers in all took part, 10 of them from the Pacific Fleet and 7 from the Atlantic. They made a total of 73 combat cruises and spent 8,248 days on the line. The USS Coral Sea took the honors for the most days spent on the line and also made the longest cruise of over 300 days from late 1964. In 12 years, 530 aircraft and 13 helicopters were lost in action. There were a further 334 operational losses. 317 aircrew were lost in action, and a total of 2,430 naval personnel were killed. It was an enormous contribution to a different kind of war, but at a very high price. The aircraft carrier is at the center of debate that has run without interruption since the end of the Second World War. During that period, there have been a series of very powerful arguments against continuing reliance on the carrier as the attacking power of the fleet. Some of these arguments have been rebutted by experience. In the post-war enthusiasm for nuclear weapons, many promoted the bomb as meaning the end of conventional warfare and of the relevance of conventional weapons, including aircraft carriers. This argument was apparently strengthened by the development of missilery. The Navy was soon able to successfully argue that the carriers and the other ships of the fleet were essential to allow conventional options in limited or localized conflict. Hedging their bets, however, Navy effort was devoted to giving the carriers nuclear strike capability. The development of long-range bombers to operate from the ships was one aspect of this drive. The argument about the redundancy of conventional warfare has been demolished by the repeated limited wars that have been fought, starting with the conflict in Korea. During that war, there were many who actively promoted the use of nuclear weapons. Some, like MacArthur, being very influential figures. However, there was a conventional option, and that was pursued. If the only available response to aggression in Korea and later instances had been nuclear attack, then history may have run into the dead end of a major nuclear conflict. Within the conventional envelope, a constantly important factor has been the aircraft carrier. The supercarriers that have evolved during the period were themselves at one time a key nuclear delivery system. Fortunately, the flat tops have been relied upon for more precise and varied power than that. The availability of nuclear weapons has not meant that they've been used. No truly appropriate moment has presented itself. There has been strong support for the use of atomic weapons from various quarters in a number of military crises. The nuclear option has defined a scale of values based on opinions about what constitutes justification for the use of nuclear force. Debate along the lines of doing away with conventional forces has, however, become a thing of the past. The resolution of the overall debate in favor of retention of conventional options still leaves considerable dispute as to the nature and balance of these conventional forces. The entire area of naval aviation has been squabbled about. In military terms, it has been questioned in relation to comparisons with missiles and land-based air forces, while in the Navy there have been many voices pushing for a stepping back from the giant carriers. At the core of this debate has been the fact that their role as the ultimate attacking force of the fleet has passed to the submarine. Some maintain that the fast attack submarine, capable of submerged speeds of around 40 knots, has rendered the surface fleet largely obsolescent. It may in fact be fair to say that as the carrier replaced the battleship as the capital ship of the fleet, so too the submarine is challenging the carrier. However, if the sub can be seen as a modern big gun, it also has to be admitted that it fires a very limited range of projectile. Subs are not good at aerial reconnaissance or at searching large areas of sea for subs. They lack the battleship's and carrier's ability in close infantry support and strike attack of moving targets. It must be remembered that a carrier never works alone, but with a potent screen of other specialist ships. Similarly, the submariners should accept that their arguments for exclusivity, for the abandonment of carriers, are only marginally rational. The modern fleet needs to be balanced and capable in all specializations, defensive and offensive. Undoubtedly, the submarine can carry weapons to sink a carrier, but even delivery of those weapons, in the face of a broad screen of anti-submarine aircraft, specialist killer ships and subs, does not assure success. Once launched, a missile now faces radar-controlled defenses designed to attempt to shoot it down in flight. The technology of the two natural enemies, the sub and the carrier, evolves as a race with no end. The constant redesign of systems has served well to keep alight the argument between the submarine and carrier enthusiasts. But the line trodden has consistently reflected the reality of the virtues of both species. Perhaps more importantly, the technological explosion has had another effect. Weaponry has unavoidably become increasingly expensive. There has been a spiraling of the cost per weapon that has served to give politicians around the globe ever-expanding nightmares. Each generation of carrier has been a bigger, more complex, more powerful, more sophisticated machine. It has been easy to be thrilled by the grandeur of these ships, which has been handy in diverting attention from the bloodless analyses of accountants.
This is the new Enterprise. She's something to see, all right. A complex instrument of war or peace, just barely dreamed of 50 years ago. A shining example of our new Navy and of sea power at its best.
The Enterprise, commissioned in 1961, the first nuclear-powered carrier, was undoubtedly a magnificent ship. Based on experience with the Forrestal-class ships, Enterprise was the most powerful weapon ever constructed when she was launched. She was also, without question, the most expensive weapon ever constructed. The bill came in at $451.3 million. The Forrestal had cost $188 million, and that had been a minor scandal. But the cost of a high-tech widget for a very limited production run of huge ships is enormous. Considerations of huge development costs spread around 6 or 7 machines make for very expensive machines. When there are thousands of such machines in one weapon, then that weapon is absolutely bound to give politicians nightmares. The next nuclear carrier after Enterprise was the USS Nimitz, seen here under construction. The Nimitz class, the 81,000-ton giants of today, arrived with the commissioning of the name ship in May 1975. Along with that ship came a bill of $1,881 million. Her successors have cracked $2 billion, and costs continue to forge on into improbable sums. The huge costs of defence saw a succession of British governments apparently give the game away, with cuts that emasculated the Royal Navy's power. At the time of the Falklands War, it was intended that the British sell their remaining new carrier. After the role of the ship in that conflict, the plans were dropped. The experience of the United States Navy has not come to the same extreme. In a similar way, the cost of new carriers was thought prohibitive by many in the US prior to the Vietnam War. During that experience, plans were made for the long-term construction of new carriers. If a ship that takes 7 years to construct is needed today but has not yet been built, there is a distinct lack of acceptable equation. Around the world, politicians have become enmeshed in a charade that has elevated economics to the status of a religion. Within this web of dominating dogma, they have struggled to subdue a reality that is intractable and uncooperative. Acceptable solutions to their dilemma would appear to be neither military nor economic, but political. In a situation where a politician is unable to weld his art of the possible to the dogmas of niggardliness, he is robbed of options. To have reality then confront our notional politician with enormous, costly, basic necessities is sufficient to make him yearn for a simpler era. Even if their motivations are driven by the apparently mundane, the weapons that today's politicians purchase or refurbish are extraordinary. A Tomcat is not simply expensive, it is a wonderful aeroplane. Viewed in terms of its job, it's a marvel. What will replace it will, logically, have to be even more impressive and probably more expensive. It is, of course, not the job of the system's designer to undermine function in the pursuit of economy. A plane's mission dictates Mach 2.3 and suggests that variable geometry is required. That this is going to make for an expensive aeroplane is not as important to the designer as that it will make an aeroplane that will do the job. Each Tomcat or Hornet carries attacking power that a World War II pilot would have found unimaginable. Today's missiles pack a punch equivalent to that era's battleship broadside. Simply by this criteria, the weapon is astonishingly advanced. But coupling this power to the guidance, range and speed of the modern armoury makes real comparisons impossible. This is one of the problems with assessing the modern carrier. There has never been anything like it, and it has never been effectively challenged. A carrier task force's vulnerability or invulnerability remains the core of theoretical dispute. What cannot be argued is that the big ships and their attendants deploy telling power. The hundreds of gun barrels that prickled over carriers in the kamikaze days have been replaced by Spartan fittings of missiles and radar-controlled quick-firing six-barreled guns. Radar has itself begun to contribute to the prickly outline, with fire control and search, ECM and ECCM sensors, homing beacons, satellite communications, IFF, missile control, and other equipment, each contributing its own array. Radar and the other electronics have romped ahead. Increasingly, the technology has been the security of the ship and its function. A 20-year-old ship, if still encumbered with her original equipment, would be a considerable burden to a navy at war. Logically, equipment with a long lifespan needs to be updated to maintain its competitive status. Inferior weaponry has shown a historical tendency to be a considerable liability. However, once again, as you refurbish, the cutting edge of technology is an expensive locality, the recurrent aspect of the politician's nightmare. The role of the ships has changed over the years, and small carriers for specialist roles have taken their place in the fleet. These roles include helicopter deployment, troop landing, anti-submarine work, and so on. In addition, the arrival of the AV-8 Harrier has opened up vistas for some of destroyer or cruiser carriers. The attack carriers, too, have increased anti-submarine relevance, both offensive and defensive. The mix of ships and the roles identified for them have been the product of a period of world history marked by constant global turmoil. Decolonization, ideological rivalries, and ideological imperialism have all contributed to flame localized conflict, and hanging over the world has been the Cold War. Instability and destabilization, national liberation fronts and national guards, coups, despots, revolutions, border bickerings, and invasions have all cluttered the period. The carriers have grown, responding to the submarines, missiles, planes, experiences in major and minor conflicts, and the hypothetical face of future war. And at every expansion of the carrier's ability, the bills inflate. Time and again, the carriers have been called for. When Korea broke out, there was a general winding down of the fleet underway, and that had to be reversed. When Vietnam escalated, the available carriers had to be spread pretty thin to provide their essential work. Debate about a new generation was curtailed by the evidence provided in Vietnam, and the Nimitz class proceeded. A schedule of replacements and refurbishments to see the Navy through to 2020 has been developed. However, the commitment to maintain the carriers ensures only a minimum level of availability. The repeated post-war experience has been that they are needed regularly. To date, calls for the carriers' services have varied widely. In addition to the grinding campaign in Vietnam, there have been a number of smaller incidents, sometimes needing to merely show the flag. The Libyan incidents of the 80s underline the value of the carriers. The Libyan government has consistently adopted a confrontational line against the West, in particular the United States. Between 1981 and 1986, there were a series of incidents which saw repeated brushes between the Libyans and US forces in the Mediterranean. The heightened tensions followed Gaddafi's declaration of a unilateral extension of Libyan territorial waters, in effect an annexation of part of the Mediterranean. This flouted international law and was accepted by no one outside Libya. The tension built slowly to 1986, when, after 2 terrorist bombings on a TWA airliner and in a West Berlin nightclub, US forces staged a series of raids on targets in the Libyan cities of Tripoli and Benghazi. Once again, the US carriers were the key to the operations. The Navy planes were not only involved in the strikes, but flew in ahead to suppress the anti-aircraft radar. There was an immediate uproar of disapproval around the globe. In particular, the Arab nations were sent into furious condemnation of the US actions. Even Egypt went near to criticism. There was only one Arab voice which refrained from comment. Saddam Hussein was embroiled in his war against Iran and wary of upsetting any possibility of supply of arms. In addition, he saw Gaddafi as a rival personality in the pan-Arab leadership stakes, and his government declined to issue a statement. The Middle East has been the backdrop to an increasing part of the call for the carriers. Duties off Lebanon and Iran have commanded their services, as the region has been gripped by a layering of unresolved conflicts. The retiring of the colonial powers left a map carved about with often artificial borders, dictated by the whereabouts of oil and the Western need for reliable supply. The Israeli state has been the center of much instability, and there have also been revolutions and coups in many of the countries of the region. Much of the world is similarly troubled, but there is no area of the planet that is so strategically important to the global economy. Reaction to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait has been, perhaps rightly, contrasted to the relative silence following the Indonesian invasion of Timor. However, perhaps to Timor's disadvantage, Kuwait is of considerably greater worldwide significance. The crisis in the Persian Gulf required a series of military measures. First of these was to get protective power to the area to secure the Saudis from attack, and then provide realistic cover to restrain Iraq from any preemptive move against the build-up of forces deployed from around the world to confront them. This is the sort of work that today's giant carrier is very good at. A carrier task force occupies a fairly small patch of ocean. It sits at the center of a circle, the radius of that circle being a combination of the range and power of its aircraft and electronics. Experience suggests that anything within that circle survives only on the basis of the carrier's tolerance. Much of Iraq's military power rapidly became covered by the overlapping of such circles as carriers moved into position. The world response to Kuwait's invasion shows a revulsion at the act and a rejection of appeasement. The world community confronted the act with more than words, and at the fore came the carriers. Only 2 things would seem likely to make carriers redundant. One would be a nuclear conflict, which happily seems to be a receding prospect. The other would be an outbreak of worldwide peace. Sadly, this remains distant, and the carriers sail on.